This is the Khmer Times News. My name is Paolo Bornini, and these are your headlines. Your residence could well be searched by the authorities on orders of the Deputy Prime Minister. The tragic tale continues as yet more illegal logging sites are discovered, and the nightmares of the elderly who still suffer the spectre of the Khmer Rouge. But first, to our main story. There is to be a check of all foreigners within the kingdom. The reason being quoted is to enforce human trafficking laws. But many are confused as to how and why the crackdown is to be implemented.
The Deputy Prime Minister has stated that the Ministry of Interior will launch a large-scale operation to inspect the lives of all foreigners. His announcement came after the United States listed Cambodia on the lowest tier in terms of human trafficking, and it seems it is that has provoked this reaction. The Deputy Prime Minister's announcement expressed his surprise at the listing given to Cambodia. He stated that Cambodia has been actively working to prevent human trafficking and said, "In order to eliminate aspects of human trafficking, the Ministry of Interior will launch a large-scale operation to inspect the lives of all foreigners, whether in hotels, construction sites, or companies." He stated that the plan to search the homes of foreigners is to find out whether people entered Cambodia illegally and to find out if the person is a victim of human trafficking. One foreigner we spoke to said, "I do not understand the policy. Surely, to see if people are working illegally, it would be easier to visit workplaces. And to infer that it is foreigners only who are involved in human trafficking seems unfair, as surely those who know how to manipulate the system and to traffic people would not be foreigners, but those with a full and detailed knowledge of crossing borders and their routes."
Last week, we ran the story of the continued looting of the kingdom's natural resources and how these crimes seem to be accelerating at speed, as vast swathes of forest are stolen to line the pockets of a few. Well, there is more sad news, as activists and members of the indigenous communities in Preah Vihear have discovered 260 illegal logging sites in yet another wildlife sanctuary.
After a 3-day patrol of the sanctuary, forest protection activists said that most of the felled trees were rare species with diameters of up to 1.5 meters and were cut down in the forest of Tabeng Menche district in Preah Vihear province. The indigenous community expressed deep sadness and shock after the discovery of the criminal slaughter of this protected area. After all, this is supposed to be a wildlife sanctuary to provide a sustainable livelihood for the indigenous community. They stated that the daily increase in forest crimes reflects the Ministry of Environment and other relevant authorities' lack of effort to protect these forests and their natural resources. A staggering 260 illegal logging sites and felled trees were discovered. The indigenous community has appealed to local authorities and the Ministry of Environment to stop restricting their right to help protect these forests. The government also needs to ensure that local officials implement the laws effectively and punish those who fail to perform their duties. This week, the Preah Vihear Provincial Environmental Department refused to comment, and a spokesman for the Ministry of Environment said they did not acknowledge the report, saying there was no need to respond to any third-party reports. The trees fall, the wildlife dies, and the country's heritage is loaded onto the back of trucks and exchanged for a handful of dollar bills.
There has been some very promising news. Poverty rates within the kingdom have plummeted to 17.8% in 2020 from nearly 40% in 2009, according to senior officials at the Ministry of Planning. Mind you, the poverty line itself is just $2.75 per day.
The Director General of Planning said that the poverty rate declined by 1.6% annually during the last decade, driven substantially by rising wages and earnings. He said that the decrease is in line with the government's commitment to reducing at least 1% of the poverty rate each and every year. He explained that every 15 years the poverty line procedure would be revised, as many people do not earn 10,000 reals per day, which means they are below the poverty line. According to the World Bank, the national poverty line in Cambodia is 10,900 real, or $2.75 per day. And about 18% of the population is identified as poor using this criteria of the World Bank. Poverty rates vary considerably by area, the bank has said, adding that the poverty rate is the lowest in the capital. Phnom Penh, it stands at 4.2%. In other urban areas, 12.6%. But the highest still remains in rural areas at nearly 23%, where many citizens have risen just above the poverty line. But there's still a high number of people experiencing the devastating effects of poverty, including malnutrition and the lack of access to basic health care.
Landmines still mutilate and the nightmares still stalk the night for many of Cambodia's elderly. The Khmer Rouge slaughtered all professionals and intellectuals, including most with an education, and those that lived in the cities were known as economic saboteurs, as city dwellers were deemed guilty of sabotage, purely because of their lack of agricultural knowledge.
Many elderly people who lived through the Khmer Rouge regime in Ode Minche have shared their memories with volunteers of Documentation Centre of Cambodia. Survivors were urged to share their suffering of starvation, slavery and forced labour, and to tell of the diseases and the executions they witnessed during Year Zero, which claimed more than 2 million innocent lives. Che Hang, a 60-year-old female survivor, said losing her loved ones never stops haunting her. She said, "The Khmer Rouge forced us to build a dam to hold the river at Battambang province. We transported soil and rocks using a small rail cart. We did not even have a spoon and had to eat watery porridge with our hands. I saw my own son, who was just 5 years old, die, and also my own grandmother, both from disease and starvation. I asked the leader of the cooperative to have my child and my grandmother buried, but he refused, saying that we did not have the strength to bury our own children or grandparents. But I did bury them. I buried them myself, next to each other, digging a shallow grave in the dirt with my own hands." Another witness, a Mr. Ton, a 60-year-old, said, "I saw the Khmer Rouge soldiers taking about 50 people out of my village. Later I saw they were just a pile of dead bodies in a pit, one laying on top of the other." Time does march on, but the echoes of the mines exploding in the fields is extremely graphic. But so are the night terrors that still haunt the elderly.
In business news, the National Bank of Cambodia anticipates the nation's GDP to grow by over 5% in 2022. That figure outperforms many other nations globally and is a very reassuring indicator of the kingdom's future.
Global growth recovery and rapid resumption in economic activity are the key factors in Cambodia's economic growth this year. According to the National Bank of Cambodia, the growth is supported by the garment, tourism, agriculture and construction sectors, according to this latest report. The kingdom's economic growth is expected to be at 5.3% this year, higher than the estimated 3% growth in 2021, higher even than the indicated figures from the World Bank. However, the Russian-Ukrainian war has led to an increase in inflation and costs of oil-related goods and services. In Cambodia, the vaccination of 94% of the 16 million population against COVID added greatly to reopening of the country's borders, says the NBC's governor. He also said Cambodia exported $11,000 million worth of products in the first 3 months of this year, up a very impressive 31% on the same period as last year, whilst imports rose by 4%. But there is a warning, and that is the country will be facing higher inflation.
And now it's time to look at our sports news. England created history by winning the first major women's tournament in the Euro 2022 final against Germany at Wembley, in an exciting game that put women's football squarely on the map. Substitute Kelly poked home a loose ball from a corner to send the raucous crowd of 87,000 into a frenzy, within just minutes of extra time remaining. On a monumental day in English football history, the English side showed that they were equal to anything that the men could do. Germany's team threw everything at them. Ella Toone scored the opener, but Germany equalised in the 79th minute. It was only in extra time the English ladies sealed the win, in front of the biggest crowd in history of men's or women's football within the Euros. It's time to have a look ahead and see what the weather has in store for us next week.
If venturing out this weekend, a bit of caution may not be such a bad thing, because look at it. It's rain, it's thunder, and it's storms yet again. This is the same old story week after week. But saying that, as we head towards next week, it does look like it will calm down some. But that does nothing for the humidity, which will be in the 90s.
This has been the Khmer Times News. You can contact myself at the studio by mailing us at ktnewsstudio@gmail.com. Please do subscribe and comment and stay up to date with all the breaking news by following us on both Facebook and Telegram. This has been Paolo Bonini, and that was the week that was. I'll see you next Saturday for your weekly roundup.